Welcome to Irish Passport.
Let's do it.
Welcome to the Irish Passport.
I'm Tim McInerney.
I'm Naomi O'Leary.
We're friends.
Cahimel to Naomi.
Anwar Fad Tim. This is your passport to Irish culture, history and politics. I'm recording.
One,
two,
three. Okay.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Irish Passport podcast. Now, Naomi, the world is a turbulent place at the moment, to say the very least, so you would be forgiven, international listeners, for missing something pretty major that has just happened and is still in many ways happening in Ireland, and that is a nationwide fuel protest. Some people are calling this the biggest protest that the Irish state has seen since 100 years. This is absolutely massive, and just to give you a visual of what has been happening in Ireland for the past week, more or less, is enormous blockades of heavy machinery, heavy farm machinery, cutting off the central thoroughfares of the capital city, Dublin, blocking ports in places like Galway, cutting off motorways, blocking off towns and roads, and basically paralyzing the country. I can't really overstate the effect that this has had on people. It's basically affected everyone. It's not just people going to work. It's really people trying to buy food, people trying to see their relatives, people trying to get back from the airport. I mean, people can't get out of the airports or into the airports. It was absolutely massive, and it has been more or less dominating Ireland from the 7th of April to the 14th of April. Now, we are recording on the 16th of April. It seems to have calmed down a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be very far from rearing its head again, possibly.
Right, and the political implications continue to roll out. You're right when you say has such a wide-ranging effect. I've seen as well that some of the national exams had to be rescheduled, for example, as well, due to just the difficulty of people getting from place to place, because people's lives in Ireland are very road-based. A lot of people rely on being able to get from A to B into work or into school on being able to travel by road.
Right.
So what has happened?
These protests have primarily been led by farmers, hauliers, transport workers, and this was all spurred, originally anyway, by the escalating fuel prices that have, of course, been a consequence of this war in Iran. Now, the escalating fuel prices are nothing to be taken lightly. We actually had a bit of a foreshadowing of this, Naomi, in our last episode, where you made a comment about, we were talking about the war in Iran, and you were making a comment about how your parents were paying for a new barrel of oil that they use as heating in their home, and that they went to order their new oil to arrive, and the next day they went and the price had doubled. Now, this is the story of basically everyone in the country. Like we said in our last episode, a lot of people in Ireland, for instance, rely on fossil fuels like oil for heat, just domestic heat in their homes. But this extends in particular to things like diesel that are not just domestically important, but of course professionally important for entire companies, entire businesses, entire livelihoods. And the price jumps since the war have been absolutely massive. You have some figures, Naomi?
Yeah. So we have some figures by the AA Ireland Fuel Price Survey. Now, it's worth noting that prices charged by different stations selling fuel differ a little bit. And also prices are affected by lots of different contributing factors, I suppose. One is government taxation or subsidy. Another one is how much it costs to get the fuel to Ireland. Ireland is a little bit of an unusual market in that it's very small and it's kind of geographically awkward to get to. Another one is, of course, the price of it on the open market, so internationally. But more or less, this is the situation. Diesel jumped by 24 cent this month, and that was on top of an 18 cent rise in the previous month. That brings it to around an average of €2.14 a litre. So that rise of more than 40 cent is massive. That's like a huge chunk. Petrol has risen to $1.91 a litre on average. So that is up in total 18 cents over the last 2 months. And the crucial one is green diesel. So green diesel is a kind of subsidised fuel that is used by farmers and the fishing industry and truck drivers. It's for professions that rely on fuel and for whom it's essential for like their bottom line. It's marked fuel. It's called green diesel as a kind of a nickname. It's cheaper but the percentage by which it has increased is much larger. So in the immediate aftermath of the US-Israel attack on Iran, it went from more or less €1 to €1.21. And since then, it's had the same increase again. So it's now about €1.42.
Right, so 40%. Basically, we're seeing a jump. And green diesel, so this is subsidies, I presume, by the government, also by the EU, I guess?
The government.
The government, I see. So, I mean, it's interesting because if this is the one that is really hitting people hard and it's already being heavily subsidized, a lot of what the protesters are asking for are more subsidies. Let's get into it for the moment. Let's get into where this all started.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a bit of a pattern in this, Naomi. We have the pattern that we have seen elsewhere in Europe of trucks being very instrumental in protests like this in the last 5 years, blocking motorways, tractors, rural protests, I suppose.
It's a tactic. If you have a really, really large vehicle, you just use it as a blockade. So you drive it to somewhere and then you stop it, and it's really difficult to move. And farmers have kind of found out that by driving convoys of tractors around the place, they can cause chaos in this way. And it's really difficult to move them on because they're such heavy machinery.
Right, indeed. And of course, there's been lots of reasons in the last 5 years, if we think about the context even of the pandemic, for things like this to be more and more common. Another trend that we're seeing, another pattern that we're seeing is this beginning on social media. So a lot of this began when the protest moved online with a Facebook page that was called The People of Ireland Against Fuel Prices. Now, I think there's loads to talk about there straight away that can kind of tell us a lot of things about where this is coming from. Facebook, listen, I know it's a cliche, but Facebook is almost certainly much more popular with older generations of people. And while maybe some people might find this patronizing, it's also known as a place where people get scammed. Because a lot of the people who are using Facebook now are much older and maybe not that...
They're more naive users.
Not that internet literate, maybe, I suppose is a better way to put it. Just wouldn't be able to spot like telltale signs of a scam or manipulation in a way that younger people might. And I mean, listen, I'm speaking as someone who is rapidly becoming one of those people myself. Technology is moving on so fast. That kind of gives us a bit of an insight into this. Facebook is where you would see a lot of the far-right movements rising up, for instance, for exactly the same reason, because it's kind of targeting people who are seen as easy marks, basically, for people who want to manipulate them. You might be forgiven for thinking that that's what's going on here. It's not. This is not a far-right movement, and certainly didn't begin as a far-right movement. However, as we'll see, the far right very much has its sights on it and has been trying to move in. Now, the second thing about this is that if we consider a Facebook movement like this and the demographic that might be using it, we can see basically that it's quite economically centered here on a group of people who have businesses, who, an older generation of people who have interest to preserve, which is quite interesting.
And who have vehicles. So they have assets.
Yes. I'll tell you, people who tune into TikTok in Ireland do not have vehicles.
Some of them do. But they probably don't have, like agricultural machinery.
Yes, indeed.
Many of them.
The last thing I want to just point out here is that title, The People of Ireland Against Fuel Prices. I mean, this has real far-right red flags. Again, it kind of makes you kind of think that this might be a far-right thing, describing yourself as the people. But here what we're seeing, I suppose, Naomi, really is more of a rural populism, right?
Yeah, so one of the kind of the ways you diagnose something as a populist movement is if it presents itself as representing the authentic voice of the people versus some kind of elite. So it does seem to fit the definition of a populist movement. And then I suppose when you look at the tactics that are being used, I think the Irish political system has been nervously anticipating a protest of this sort, but was still blindsided and didn't realise that the attack on Iran would be the trigger point for it. The use of the tractors, the base behind the support, but behind the movement being, agricultural, and also in the haulage sectors and so on. It is familiar to sorts of protests that we've seen in different parts of Europe and indeed around the world, with the kind of farmers' protest movement that kicked off in the Netherlands, usually has a kind of an anti-green tint to it, and has a populist tint, and is very there are certain sympathies with the far right and this movement. So obviously a certain section of the people who are really angry about fuel prices will also have far right views, but also the far right see this as like they want to own this protest.
Yeah.
So very quickly we saw people who are already existing prominent far right activists seeking to associate themselves with the protest, almost to take credit for the protest and position themselves as leaders of them. But they weren't always accepted. So some of the existing protesters like kicked them out, for example, of organizing WhatsApp groups and didn't want their movement to be discredited by these people. So it's mixed. At the same time, after one of the protests on O'Connell Street, the Muslim Sisters of Era, who are a very well-established group of Muslim women who feed the homeless and people who are struggling in inner city Dublin, were attacked violently by some of these people saying, go back home and things like that. So definitely, like, there are elements involved in the orbit of these protests that are have anti-immigration views.
Yeah, right. It is really interesting, actually, that it feels like this movement caught the far right a little bit on the back foot. Like, it feels like they've come to this a little bit late and they're really trying to catch up. And it does feel a little bit like they've been robbed. They kind of looked around and said, what are you, how did you make this without us? Like,
this should have been our idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We usually direct you in these kind of things, right?
Yeah.
But, yeah, exactly. So they're trying to get their way in, like, in any way they can. I've seen that the British activist Tommy Robinson has been making comments about these protests. It's always fascinating how British nationalists start to talk about Irish nationalism when they get involved in this kind of thing, using words like treason and the people and all this.
Yeah.
Katie Hopkins, remember her?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a name I haven't heard for a while.
I know, a blast from the past. A kind of early noughties, like, she was on the circuit of reality TV and then became a bit of a far-right pundit there for a while. Conor McGregor has piped up about this. Listen, they're still kind of trying to make it their own movement, though.
Yeah.
And we do have to remember that there are movements like this that are populist, that aren't necessarily concerned, not because they're good, upstanding people who want equality for everyone, just because that's not really what they're protesting for. There's a lot of people here who are just very legitimately angry about fuel prices and are not that angry about immigration.
Their demands have been for the government to intervene and to subsidise the price of fuel. They also had other demands, sometimes the resignation of the Taoiseach Micheál Martin at times.
Yes.
It's a disparate movement and there have been different demands at different times. They were more or less successful. So it took about 5 days from the protest to break out for the government to come up with a 500 million package of intervention to cushion the blow of high fuel prices. And this involves direct payments to hauliers and also bus operators, farmers, so on, cuts in duties on petrol and diesel and so on, and a reduction on the green diesel, and also delays in the increases to the carbon tax. So they were more or less successful, although not yet in getting Micheál Martin to resign. Interestingly as well, this kind of solution that the government presented coincided with the arrival of a kind of crackdown by the police. Yeah. So it took about 4 or 5 days for the Irish police the Gardaí to get to grips with the situation. So it was kind of like chaos reigned for several days. And then from about April 11th and especially overnight into April 12th, the Gardaí began to move in to physically remove some of the blockades that had been in place, which these are very unusual scenes for Ireland. Usually we don't have this level of disruptive protest. And also members of the Irish Armed Forces were present as well, which is very symbolic, very unusual. And they began to be moved on. And as things stand, things have quietened down. I do think, though, that having proved how effective this can be, this won't be the last time we see this kind of protest.
Well, no, exactly. And I think it's so interesting, actually, to see this because, listen, things like major strikes like this are really common in a lot of Europe. I mean, I speak as someone who lives in France. This is just a very, very common thing in France. And there's two differences, though, that are like really stand out and that really make this kind of interestingly worrying, I suppose, for Ireland. One of them is that Ireland was just so unprepared for this. I think need to talk about this more in a minute, because when protests like this happen in Paris, I'm not joking, like once a month. And I mean protests exactly like this, where ports are blocked, where the entire ring road around Paris, which is the capital city, is paralyzed for a day, or by trucks. The exact same kind of thing. It's been going on for decades. But the country is just very equipped to deal with it. Like, life generally goes on as normal, except for a fairly minor part of the population. That's one difference. But a second difference is that in places like France and Spain and Italy, where you have these major strikes, very often and traditionally, they have been highly politicized on the left of the political spectrum. So I think it's a really interesting thing that is just not I'm not used to as someone who grew up in Ireland, as protesting as a kind of sport. I don't mean to belittle it, but a lot of people in France who go on big demonstrations, on strikes and etc., they like it. It's like a hobby as well. I mean, I'm not trying to undermine their political convictions. They absolutely have political convictions behind it, but they look forward to it and they have a good time.
It's an exercise of civic duty, they see it.
Exactly.
We saw, it's actually practiced in school.
Right.
So teachers will do a simulation protest for the students where they get to make banners and then they go to a place and they act out doing a protest. It's seen as like part of what you do as your function in society. A regular thing, not a one-off extreme measure.
Yeah. And you definitely, like, you have people who are into model airplanes and you have people into protests, right? I mean, it's kind of seen like that as well, in a way. But it's owned by the left, right? In a place like France. Like, the tradition of protesting like this is absolutely owned by the left. All the songs are these old left-wing songs from the Second World War, First World War, etc. Every now and again, the right protest, right? And I always find it quite fascinating. So we saw it with the Gilets jaunes. It's kind of a right-wing protest. It was hard to pin politically.
Yeah.
Another example was anti-gay marriage protests and things like that, where you can kind of see this exhilaration from the people who are protesting because they never get to do it. They never get a chance to do it, right? So they really enjoy it when they are doing it. Now, I think there is I'm trying to bring this back to your point, Naomi. Nestled in here is a world of potential. When a political front sees the value in a movement like this that they just haven't traditionally used in order to get leverage for themselves, and when they see that they actually enjoy doing it too, you can be sure that it's going to happen again, right? Why wouldn't it? And especially if they're successful. Yeah. I mean, back in the day, people would have written folk songs about this, getting the money from the government. You can see it. Maybe they're doing it right now. Now, I think it's so geopolitically interesting in Ireland in this point of view. If we think about this as a left-wing style protest that is not being carried out by an organised left-wing, but is being carried out by this extremely libertarian, dispersed, small c conservative ground base. Right. So we're not looking at a far-right movement either. We're looking at people who are coming together basically because it is expedient for them to do so, but do not march under these banners of associations or unions or things like this. These are individual business owners with the same interests here and now at the same time, and who have found a kind of voice within that. And it's money interests as well, which just makes it so different. It's not standing up for people's civil rights. It's not standing up for principles. It is actual very personal financial interests that every single one of those protesters have. I'm ranting a little bit. I just found it fascinating though.
That's really interesting, the way you put it. The political fallout of this is continuing. So although there has been a respite to the kind of the disruption in the country for now, which by the way is just as well, because one of the things they did was they blockaded Ireland's only oil refinery, and it meant that supplies of oil couldn't reach the country because there was a backlog in processing and there wasn't storage available, which actually threatened to cause a very real shortage and to worsen the situation. And, people were getting concerned. There were runs on petrol stations, things like this. So it was very much threatening to kind of spiral. But having said that has been parked for now, but the political fallout continues. So it culminated in a voting of confidence in the government, which split. So the opposition called this, and, all voted against the government as would be expected. But crucially, two prominent TDs who'd sat on the side of the government, who had been supporting the government, resigned. They crossed the floor, they voted against the government, and that was the Healy-Raes. Danny Healy-Rae and Michael Healy-Rae, who had been a junior minister, resigned his position and voted against the government, saying that the government had let the people of Ireland down.
Now, you might recognize these names, listeners, because they have come up in previous episodes of the podcast. We've made, they've definitely featured fairly prominently in about 3 different episodes, Naomi, but you definitely made a kind of like a biography little episode of them at one stage, not that long ago.
I have to apologize because I just find them really interesting, so I return to them a lot. And also they're kind of a uniquely Irish phenomenon, so
I think
there's
we
just
got
so
calls.
much to say about them.
I think people asked us to say more about them, actually, originally. So just a bit of a recap. These are extremely canny politicians who present themselves as the face of rural Ireland. They come from Kerry. They put on a bit of a shtick. They really highlight their accents. They dress up in farmers' outfits in like in a performative way that we discussed in those episodes, because they really want that to be their image, right? I mean, listen, there's nothing wrong with this. Like, they're just very proud of where they come from, but like they're trying to make themselves instantly recognizable like this, and they have succeeded. Extremely popular in their constituency and extremely powerful in the Dáil, and fairly powerful business people as well. Listen, if you want to hear all about them, they are actually just fascinating. Go and listen to Naomi's episode on it. We'll put a link maybe in the show notes, because it also tells us a lot about how democracy works in Ireland. I think that was one of the most interesting parts of it. But them resigning is fairly consequential. I mean, this is a big moment for them. This is their voter base, right, that is out on the streets, and they get to show themselves as, standing up for, quote unquote, the people.
I think that's the thing. So if you were to ask me to bet on whether the Healy-Raes would have still been supporting the government by the time of the next election, I would have put a lot of money on no. In my opinion, they would have found something to resign over before the election came. I don't see them going into an election and facing their voters and wanting to do that, being held to account for the record of the government. Like, it doesn't work. It's much better for them politically if they're able to resign and then be like, if constituents have complaints about what the government will be doing, they'll be like, I agree. That's why I resigned, and they can be on the same side. So I don't think that they would have lasted the entire term of the government anyway. But it's interesting that they picked this moment. So to me, because I do credit their political nous, they're very canny politicians, I think they sense the potency of this particular issue and this particular movement, particularly in their voter base. So this kind of rural populism, that's where they're coming from. And they've this is where they've decided to call it and resign. And also the anti-green element is crucial as well, because they are among the most anti-green politicians in Parliament, in the Dáil Éireann.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Now, the other responses from the opposition have been really interesting as well. A lot of them settled on the idea that the government was too slow to act, that they should have set up a meeting as soon as they possibly could with these protest groups, and that not doing so led this to just spiral out of control. So that's what Sinn Féin has been saying a lot, for instance, in the Dáil. People Before Profit called to expand protests into a broader movement, which kind of speaks to what I was saying earlier. I think that's absolutely fascinating because, of course, People Before Profit would love that kind of left-wing style mass protest to be happening in Ireland, and they're appealing to a group that is very much conservative, very much capitalistically interested in business in order to do that. So that's just a fascinating kind of political kind of cross-pollination, I suppose. Then we have the other parties like Labour, the Social Democrats, and Aon Tú, which is the kind of right-wing version of Sinn Féin, very minority. They were saying things like, just stop the protests, but they were saying to the government, sit down with the protesters. So they're kind of saying the protest is wrong and the government is wrong. Which is kind of interesting. And I think a lot of, if we did a Vox Pop, would hear a lot of that actually from Middle Ireland, if you put it that way.
I mean, I think, yes, many people would have shared the concerns of the protesters, but the extent of the disruption caused was something else. I mean, I think a lot of people reacted negatively to that. It has become the occasion for, once again, a consideration of the future political political career of Taoiseach Micheál Martin. So now you have backbenchers making statements of confidence in Micheál Martin, things like that. Always a concerning sign if you're a politician, of people talking about how they give you their full confidence, because it means that there's the scent of a resignation in the air. This happens repeatedly to Micheál Martin. So like, year in, year out, there are these periodic heaves, as they're called, against him. He has rivals within his own party, and he's just been around for such an incredibly long time as a politician that every now and again, Fianna Fáil has this little think about what's the plan for succession, and his rivals get the idea of getting rid of him. And so it's become an occasion for that again, and he had avoided it for a little while, and now it's back again. People talking about his leadership.
Poor old Micheál. It's never far away from Micheál.
No,
we talked about
in
it
the wings all
also
the time.
in our last episode.
Yeah.
Another foreshadowing. We said, somehow he survived this one again.
Yeah.
Now, this is a really tricky one for him. He's going to have to really play his cards, or play his chess right, I think, in this one. Because, like you just said there, and I think this is a key thing at this current moment, the tidal change in people's attitudes towards the protesters is very dynamic, and it's still kind of happening as this is panning out. At the beginning, yes, a lot of people supported these protesters, and I think it depends on whether you were affected or whether you weren't affected, actually, a large extent, or whether you turned against them. I think that a lot of people were kind of, they found it distasteful. I think a lot of the coverage that I saw on social media, for instance, left a very bad taste, actually, that I think a lot of people would react badly to. So I'll give you a good example.
Yeah.
There's a comedian called David McSavage. Is that his name? McSavage or Savage? Yeah, McSavage. He was on TV in the 90s and early 2000s quite a bit. And he does gigs around, and you'd know him. You know his face. He did a reel on Instagram recording himself saying that he was going to see if he could get through the protesters because he's trying to go to Cork. So he went up to the protesters, had a bit of banter with them, and flashed his celebrity face, basically. Flashed his celebrity face and said, lads, will you just let me in? Ha ha ha. They had a bit of a joke with them. They said, go on so, and they let him through.
Okay.
And he said, up the protest, and they all had a laugh. And it was, in one way, a kind of fun, lighthearted moment. But in another way, it was like, hold on. Oh, celebrities get through the line because you like them and you saw them on TV once and you think they're a bit of a laugh. But like this, man who wants to visit his mother, can't get through. Like,
or people trying to get into hospital.
Some people got fun treatment because they were the lads, and some people didn't. That's enough, actually, to kind of turn people off, because it brings in a real boys' club aspect to this, actually. That's very distasteful. Who the hell are you to decide who gets to use the road? Like, I mean,
I see.
Who elected you, actually? Like, who gave you this power over me? This is not how protests work. If you actually want to paralyze the place, like, you paralyze the place, but you're acting kind of like a king with a scepter, and, you're enjoying the power. I think that's the distasteful thing, enjoying the power, right?
I didn't see that particular instance, but the papers were covering different terrible things to do with people who needed medical attention or something and couldn't get it. But obviously, if you set up a barricade, you're going to cause massive traffic jams. So not everyone is going to be able to plead their case to you individually because they're going to be really far back in the queue.
Right.
So we don't know.
Exactly. And
you don't know who you're affecting.
What are the criteria? When do you decide that me going to the hospital is important enough?
Yeah.
Like, exactly. Is it a broken toe? Broken hand, broken arm, tell me please, when do you let me through? Like, no, it's not okay, really.
Another nuanced criticism that I came across was kind of mocking these people for seeing themselves as the primary victims of this conflict, when obviously, people are losing their lives and stuff. That was another kind of a criticism that I got. And I would say that among the left, there's a lot of suspicion of these protests because there's a suspicion of their association with the far right, and there's a lot of scrutiny over them. How far right are they? Are they really? Or who's behind it, and so on.
Yes. So sorry, I actually got completely off the point there.
Yeah.
I was trying to bring this back to Micheál Martin and saying that either he can come out of this as the person who solved this crisis by standing up to the protesters and kind of gaining public support that way, or the person who solved this crisis by giving the protesters what they badly needed and recognizing their concerns, right? I mean, he has to play it one way or the other, really.
I think that the root problem of this is that, unfortunately, the Irish government finds itself in a position where it is subject to something that has a dramatic impact on people's lives that it cannot control. The Irish government cannot really control the price of fuel.
Yeah.
And we can't infinitely subsidize it because there isn't enough money in the world to do that. The problem is Ireland has no leverage over whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is opened or not.
Yeah.
And we haven't made ourselves resilient against those shocks, even though that was something that Ireland knew it had to do. There hasn't been the appetite among the public to support moving away from dependence on fossil fuels. We were already warned about this. There was already a price shock in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine. Like, this is all like a rerun of something that happened really recently. But Ireland remains overwhelmingly dependent on energy imports, and it's very, very dependent on gas in its electricity system as well.
And lots of people are talking about the kind of short-sightedness that a protest like this has, even if maybe the reaction is panic and shock at these escalating fuel prices. But we are really just seeing the beginning of this massive international crisis.
Yeah.
Like, the European Union's Energy Commissioner has just warned today that the whole continent is going to face higher gas prices for years. Like, it's just going to be years and years of this. And the head of the International Energy Agency this morning said that Europe has, I quote, maybe 6 weeks of jet fuel left.
Wow. Yeah. We could maybe paint the broader picture a little bit. Ireland isn't the only country that's introducing packages of support in response to this. It's a little bit unique in that this was produced in the context of being sort of forced to do by these protesters, but I think they would have had to done something anyway, to be honest. So yeah, me and my colleagues, like in our paper, we pulled together a kind of overview around Europe of what everyone is doing, and like every country is doing something. So it's kind of a range of subsidies. Like France has just subsidized fuel for the month of April for farmers, same people, farmers, truckers, fishermen. Also, making available short-term loans, things like that, bringing back some of the COVID era supports, like making it possible to put people on temporary leave and things like that to reduce your staff bill, all this kind of stuff. What's different though is some countries are being more explicit that, like, no, there needs to be a medium to long-term solution to this, which is to move away from our reliance on these fuels. And some countries are putting money towards actually fixing this. So electrification. So stuff like subsidizing the purchase of electric trucks, electric vans, like electric machinery, so that you don't need to be buying diesel for them. And moving away from the use of fossil fuels in home heating, which is a massive issue in Ireland. We're very unusual in needing to like fill up oil tanks like that. And there are heat pumps. The technology exists and has existed for a while to have an alternative to this. And so I actually looked into some of these issues this week. I was reporting on an article which wasn't looking at fuel prices, but what it was looking at was the cost of electricity. And why is the cost of electricity, why has it diverged dramatically between different European Union countries since the start of the war? And I basically looked at the case of Spain, because Spain is really, really interesting. Spain in 2022, when there was the last gas price shock, very badly affected. Total crisis for the government. People's bills went crazy. They had to make extraordinary measures, and it was like a big disaster. This time around, very different story. Spain has consistently among the very cheapest prices in Europe. Now, this is on wholesale electricity markets, so this is the actual cost of producing energy. Extremely cheap. Just to give you an idea, in Ireland, I think it was the day I took him to look at in my article was Tuesday. As I recall, it's 1 megawatt hour of electricity. The cost of 1 megawatt hour in Ireland was about 180 euro. In Spain, it was 44. And that difference is more dramatic sometimes. So sometimes in Spain, it's like 3 euro. Stuff like that, whereas in Ireland it's like 160, 170, 180. And Ireland was on Tuesday was the most expensive, Spain was the cheapest. So why is this? What's happened between 2022 and 2026 to make Spain no longer having like these crazy high wholesale electricity prices when there's a gas spike? It's because Spain has increased the amount of renewables in its energy generation system dramatically since 2022. Okay, so in 2022, It was about 42% or so of the general energy use of Spain that year was produced by renewables. On Tuesday, it was 65%. So it's now the majority. And they've just kind of been hell for leather building solar and wind. That's basically the situation. To the extent that they almost don't need to use gas. It comes in really rarely. They have a whole mix. So they have nuclear as well. That's part of the mix. But like I just looked at Tuesday. On Tuesday, gas produced only 0.2% of the general electricity demand of Spain. So a tiny percent. I don't have the figures for Ireland for Tuesday, but I can tell you that in 2024, gas produced like 40% of our electricity. So 0.2 versus 40%. It's a huge difference. And at times it was even like 83%. So in times of surges of demand. Why does it matter so much about the gas price? Obviously we've been talking about how gas prices are expensive, but it actually has a really uniquely powerful influence on the overall cost of energy in Europe because of something called marginal pricing. It's the way the energy markets in Europe are designed. Basically, gas, as we all know, if you've ever used a gas cooker or a gas hob, can be turned on and off really quickly. Okay, so like, want the gas, you don't want the gas, goes on and off. Other power generation isn't like that. Nuclear, you can't just switch it on and off. So gas is unique. So the role it plays in the mix of the energy production is when you don't quite have enough from everything else, then the gas kicks in. The gas switches on, fires up, and you get the gas energy. On the wholesale electricity markets, the most expensive kind of energy that you've used that hour sets the price for everything. So if gas is €1, and that's the most expensive, everything's going to be €1. Even if it's free, even if it's coming from solar power, even if it's coming from wind and it's free, everything gets charges. So if you have to resort to using gas a lot in your system and gas is suffering one of these price surges, it means that it makes all of your energy across the board really expensive. Even if you have to just use 1% of gas that hour, it's going to cause everything to be really expensive. It has this dramatic effect of like causing the cost of electricity to be really high. Now, just to make clear, that doesn't translate exactly to household energy bills, because household energy bills are affected by stuff like the prices that your network is charging and whether your government is adding a tax or adding a subsidy or whatever it is. So they vary a bit. But obviously, if the underlying wholesale electricity price is lower, your ultimate bill is going to be lower as well, of course. Eventually, there might be a little bit of a delay between them. But anyway, so that's really interesting. That tells us so much about the Irish electricity system, our energy system, and why it's so expensive. It's because we have a really high reliance on gas and we haven't built enough renewables. And it doesn't have to be that way because other countries have managed to break that link and reach a threshold whereby their energy is now cheap and not being set by the high price of gas all the time.
Wow. Listeners, I feel it is my duty to tell you that Naomi had not one single note, not in a distance around her when she said all that. That just all came from the tip of your tongue. So it's good to know that you have all that just ticking away there in your brain, Naomi. But it is a scary landscape that we're looking at here.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. So like the US, I think they're realizing a bit not more than they can chew. It's not easy to fix this situation. And like every other country is trying to deal with this. We're recording here in Paris, actually. And here, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is coming tomorrow to meet with Emmanuel Macron. And the two of them are talking about how do we open the Strait of Hormuz. But the fact is that neither of them has a good answer to that because none of them want to go to war. They don't want to actually become combatants in this thing. So they're saying we're building a coalition to open the Strait of Hormuz, but this is only happening if the war actually stops and the Iranians agree that we do this. And like the Iranians are just not going to agree to that because that's their leverage. This is their whole ace card that they're holding is the Strait of Hormuz and blockading it. And the US can't fix it. And unfortunately, the US has poisoned the well of diplomacy. So they broke agreements. They went to war, against international law. They made a preemptive strike or whatever. They have no credibility. So if they're saying, "Oh, we'll solve this by talks," the Iranians have no reason to believe them. So it's this awful situation which is really difficult to solve.
Yeah, and finding a solution to this, of course, is just all the more impossible, really, when you're dealing with just kind of such unpredictable behavior. The last few days, Donald Trump has been in a spat with the Pope, saying like that's what has been concerning him. He's having a little Twitter fight basically with the Pope, saying that the Pope is this is a pretty great quote, weak on crime.
I know, it's ridiculous.
In the Vatican, I guess. Just that rampant crime in the Vatican.
It is funny though. This is actually the story I'm going to write about tomorrow. It's going to be like Pope Leo. Pope Leo is so interesting. He's taking a stand on the war. He hasn't put his head above the parapet on pretty much anything until now, but he's like, no, we are for peace. This is the thing we're making a stand on. It doesn't matter how much like the US politicians are going to rant and rave about it.
And he's an American Jesuit, right?
Yeah, so it's very important that he's American.
Yeah. I wonder, does Trump know that? I don't know. Right. So listen, I think coming back to Ireland a little bit.
Yeah.
This situation is maybe something that the government is going to need to really start planning for.
Yeah.
Considering the vulnerabilities that you just highlighted there, I suppose almost kind of emergency measures concerning things like energy might be brought in. One of the most worrying things about this was how quickly Ireland ran out of resources.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that was really scary because it was like I said earlier, it was like, oh, this is just a protest that happens in a lot of Europe all the time on this scale of like a protest that most of Europe is used to handling. So if you can't handle this, if something really bad happened, like there was a point there where there was 3 days left of oil basically in the country. And the whole thing only lasted a week. So like, geez, Naomi.
I know. We're very reliant on imports for this stuff. And I remember late last year, I got a report which was looking at kind of Ireland's vulnerability to kind of major crises. And something that stuck with me, a detail that stuck with me, was that if there was some sort of major incident at Dublin port, the food would start disappearing from shelves in Ireland within 3 days.
Like, it almost did already.
Yeah.
Like, considering that trucks couldn't get through the major motorways and stuff.
That's very vulnerable. Like,
yeah.
So I think like our country has been running okay in like times of plenty and ease.
Yeah.
But we're not really set up for difficult times. And something that kind of you can illustrate that because like do you remember back in the crisis in the initial kind of period of the invasion of Ukraine? Russia cut off gas supplies to Europe. It was a tactic they used constantly for years to exert political pressure. They did it really to put pressure on Germany to turn the public against supporting Ukraine, you know, and the response by countries on the European continent was to introduce gas rationing. I don't know if you remember this, but it was stuff like we're not running our lights at night. Everyone got advice about using the washing machine and appliances to reduce energy use. And it was also to bring down bills because of what I explained about the gas kicking in and then the prices being really high.
They turned down the heat in swimming pools.
That's
what I remember the most.
Yeah, it weren't allowed. It was like limits on what you could put on air conditioning or heating, all this kind of stuff. Ireland didn't do any of that. We were like, we don't need to because we weren't getting our gas from that pipeline. We get it from the UK. It's like a different system. We just didn't bother. So we didn't bother to do any of that. So like the Irish public has not before been exposed to this stuff. We're being exposed to this one now because we, you know, like so many people, we are exposed to the Strait of Hormuz effect. But there isn't now. We are not, the public has not been prepared like in other European countries from that prior experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, not prepared for that. And authorities in Ireland are not prepared for protests.
Right.
Like I know, listen, lots of authorities aren't prepared for protests, that's the whole point, but they're really not prepared for protests, like really badly.
Yeah.
And I mean, at least they got a bit of a heads up on this one because of those Dublin riots that a few years ago kind of highlighted the security holes or the holes in city security or police response.
Yeah.
So clearly they had bulked themselves up a little bit in advance of that. But even with dealing with protests, I mean, the government just seemed so in the air about what to do about this or how to handle it. And that's another strange privilege. I mean, it is an odd thing, Naomi, that Irish people don't protest more.
Yeah.
Considering that the whole state was founded on like not just one protest, but like, you know, decades of like very intense and very culturally ingrained protests.
And political activism.
Involvement.
And there's so much, detachment from it now.
I mean, so much detachment.
Yeah.
Like older people would see it as something bordering on disgraceful.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
Is it stigmatized because political activism for a while was associated with the Troubles and violence in the North. Is that what's going on here?
Maybe. But then the Troubles and the violence in the North was protest, and so at least there was action there. I think it would actually be people who were already adults. Oh, I mean older adults during the Troubles.
Yeah.
And I think it was maybe the Catholic Church. I think that maybe it's the association of protest with like communism.
Okay.
And or a religionism or kind of lack of respect of like hierarchy or something.
Okay.
I think maybe it comes from that because I think the people, the boomers basically, who were the ones who were protesting in the 60s and the 70s in the North and in the South during the Troubles, like they kind of took up like a mantle, right? But if you talk to their parents, who will be our grandparents, they're the ones who really just find it disgraceful. And a lot of words have been used about this protest, actually, and filtered down, I suppose, through the generations. Things like, let me see, like criminals or thugs or, just a lot of quite violent imagery to describe the protests.
Yeah.
Which is like fair enough coming from their political point of view, but you hear it a lot straight away, this idea that to protest at all is a criminal act.
To inconvenience people, definitely.
Yeah.
And there's a really visceral reaction to it from people who might not be that conservative as well.
Yeah.
Which is like, this must be, it shouldn't be allowed, it shouldn't be forbidden. It's like abhorrent behavior. Yeah.
Which has led to a situation where, listen, there have been protests over the last few decades in the South, but nothing really on a massive scale. So when I said at the beginning of this episode, some people have been saying that this is the biggest protest basically since independence in the 26 counties.
Yeah.
I mean, that shows you really how little protest there actually has been. Like very, very little relatively in comparison to other countries.
Water charges.
Oh yes, the water charges. It's weird because the country has been in a position for about 2 decades where there's an awful lot for the grassroots to protest about. And one of the first things I said to you, Naomi, when we were talking about these protests a few days ago, was I was scanning the comments in the more raggish newspapers that allow comments still underneath them.
Yeah.
So I was just so interested. I was so interested to see if anyone would bring up the housing crisis. Because I just thought, like, wow, why didn't anyone do anything about this, anything like this because of the housing crisis? Like, people are living in shared bedrooms and paying, €1,000 a month, students and people, like, a rent strike is something that people could have done very easily if they joined together on a Facebook group, just everyone stopped paying rent, for instance, and everyone would have been behind them, pretty much. Well, actually, the landlords, who are a lot of people, wouldn't. But, it wouldn't have this same kind of fallout, right? All you'd get is a few very, very rich people being a little bit less rich for a little while until the government, talked about it. Oil would still come to people's houses. There is a lot, that people could protest about, and they don't. So now that they have, the second thing I did think about as well when I heard about these protests breaking out on O'Connell Street was, I said, well, the police won't be able to deal with this. The Irish police they're just not equipped to deal with this on any meaningful scale. Certainly not with big tractors and stuff. That was my first thought. That's not a first thought that should be coming into your head, really, if you have confidence in the authorities that run basic stuff, like, possible street violence that could have arisen from this. I suppose they did get rid of the tractors.
They did, actually, yeah.
So you have to give them that.
I think they probably learned from the looting and rioting that happened in Dublin not so long ago, because that was a kind of an early warning system. It took ages for that to be brought under control because there was all sorts of failures, like the Gardaí who were to be deployed as the anti-riot police didn't have their shields in the right location, so they had to go and get them, and this kind of stuff. So I think definitely they have been put on notice that there's an issue there, and I think probably even the tactic of going in the early hours, that's like a very tried and tested tactic from elsewhere. So definitely they've been boning up for this for sure.
Yes, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
And that brings you to the naivety of the protesters themselves. The fact that the 200 guards, were able to get rid of all of those heavy machines and get rid of the protest by using a fairly kind of standard tactic to do so, and that they were successful, shows you that the protesters aren't experienced in protesting either. Like, this is at the point in continental Europe, where you would see the Molotov cocktails come out, and people would just start throwing fire and like stones and hurling. Everyone would be ready for this moment. In fact,
the confrontation.
The whole protest would be leading up to that,
Yeah.
to the point where they knew they were going to be cleared out in the early hours, and then it would all kick off, and that's what the headlines would actually only really be about. Usually,
Yeah, interesting. Well,
all right. I think we've pretty much exhausted all there is to say about this for the moment. Do you have anything else to add on the matter, Naomi?
I guess just maybe something on the bigger picture. So like at the moment, we're seeing these signs of very concerning tipping points, right, for climate change, which would make the model of farming, for example, in Ireland become unsustainable. So that way of making a living wouldn't be possible with the extent of climate change that it may become possible due to these tipping points. So there is a kind of an irony to protests against any change to the status quo, and to the anti-green tinge that you get to these protests, which are demanding continued subsidies for fossil fuels. There is a kind of an irony to that, because it is in the long term against the self-interest of the people who are arguing for it. And something I found really interesting was so after I had that article published this week, which was about the different energy prices in Europe, and particularly looking at the case of Spain and why it was so cheap there, I got such emotional reaction to it. Really, it's very unusual. It's not that usual for me to get loads of emails in response to an article, and many people were annoyed. They didn't want this to be true. People don't want it to be attributable to renewables. They don't want renewables to be an easy solution, because there's some sort of resistance to changing the status quo. There's some kind of there's an emotional barrier there, and it's really, really strong in Ireland. We just haven't taken the steps that we need to do to become more resilient as a country.
Yeah, and the status quo in this case, I mean, when you go to rural Ireland, it's not a countryside of cottages and happy little hamlets and picturesque things. It's a countryside really of ranches. It's all you can describe them as, are ranches. And all of it is kind of built on an unsustainable model, I think, if you would say that. For instance, a very common scene that you will see is an absolutely massive house. I mean, a house that really should be a small hotel. We're talking 7 or 8 bedrooms maybe, or all the rooms are so big that that's the superficial size of it. And then a enormous lawn that covers the area of maybe half a football pitch, but doesn't have anything growing in it. Just a lawn that requires mowing all the time. This is an aesthetic, a kind of life aesthetic in rural Ireland that is based on unsustainability. It's based on consumption. It's based on kind of using things, and very much not based on communal living. It's not based on kind of thinking about other people in any way. It's kind of ranch living. And I think that architecture and that way of thinking about where you live and how you live itself reflects a mind frame that's very difficult to change.
So on that note, I guess all we can do is look forward now to what comes next. Interestingly, I think the moment, so we've seen governments around Europe step in with subsidies for fuel and to cushion the blow of this energy crisis, but it's not fiscally sustainable for them to continue to do that, because this new crisis is so unwelcome. It's coming at a time where the inflation was just getting under control, and governments were just kind of looking to have a period of normality after the disruption of the pandemic and Ukraine and all of that, and then this has kind of dramatically reversed that situation, and it's introduced this element of volatility and unpredictability that is so difficult. It's so difficult to contain. We don't know how long this is going to go on for, and it doesn't look like it has an easy solution. So it's kind of it is a little bit concerning, and definitely prices could continue to go, and there could go up, and there isn't an infinite amount of policy choices in front of governments to deal with that.
Yeah, and that 500 million has got to run out.
Yeah.
What do we do then?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll be here to make a new episode when that happens.
We'll be here and just as well, Ireland until now, and as of now at least, has a lot of fiscal cushion from all of those multinationals paying tax.
Yeah.
For now, anyway.
If you are feeling down about the state of the world at the moment, a great thing that you can do is tune in to the extra content that we produce over on Patreon. We have over 100 extra content episodes over there, ranging from all sorts of things, serious stuff like this, to much less serious stuff, and you will be supporting the podcast along the way. So if you want to find all of those, you can head over to www.patreon.com/The Irish Passport and become a Patreon supporter today.
Thanks so much for listening.
Slán, everyone.
Slán.